Good afternoon. Today with us will be Vasilis Evangelidis. A few words about his CV. He's a research associate at the Athena Research Center, specializing in classical and digital archaeology. He holds degrees in history and archaeology from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki, and then a Master Science in Digital Archaeology from the University of Southampton. His research focuses on the urbanization, architecture, and material culture of the Hellenistic and the Roman periods, with a strong emphasis on digital methodologies such as GIS and 3D reconstructions. He has published monographs and numerous articles on the archaeology of Roman Greece and Macedonia. He is the organizer of the AGIS Athena Laboratory in Xanthi and co-organizer of the Roman Seminar in Athens. He is currently preparing a new monograph on the archaeology of Aegean Thrace to be published by Bloomsbury Academic. So thank you very much, Vasilis, for being here with us. And you may start your lecture.
Okay, thank you. First of all, hello to everyone. I will start, of course, by expressing my sincere gratitude and thanks to Katerina Ritzouli and Zoe Tsirtsoni for the invitation. Mostly because when Katerina spoke to me about the dialogues, it gave me the chance, the opportunity to reflect on ideas rooted in my previous research, which I have also, as Katerina said, been developed now in my forthcoming book on Aegean Thrace, basically on the landscapes of Aegean Thrace, on Roman Aegean Thrace, but because the area here is so peculiar, the least I can say, basically has a diachronic aspect, which will be published by Bloomsbury Academics. So today, I hope to show you that discussing Roman architecture is not only a matter of standardization or monumentality, as we always hear, but also of long-standing architectural tradition that continue to shape the built environment. So with no further ado, I'm starting. The only thing I have to clarify is I am co-directing the AGS lab with Desmina Tsiafaki, okay, in order to be correct. So during the Roman imperial periods, northern Greece, which basically corresponds largely to the Roman province of Macedonia and parts of Thrace, underwent one of the most profound transformations in its architectural and urban history. From the late 1st century BCE through the 4th century CE, new cities, and you see here a slide with all the cities of the province of Macedonia, new cities appeared, older settlements were reorganized, and architectural forms familiar from across the Roman Empire reshaped the landscape. Now, when we think about Roman architecture in Greece, we usually think first of the south, and that means Athens, Corinth, Nicopolis, Olympia, and so on. Places with long monumental histories. And you see, of course, here, the monumental Cardo in Corinth, the theater in Nicopolis, and the reconstruction done by Christos Kanellopoulos, and I don't remember the name, Dimitris Chalkanis, about the library of Hadrian in Athens. By contrast, Roman Macedonia and Roman Thrace, Roman Aegean Thrace, have often been described as more peripheral, let's say, as regions that simply absorbed imperial models, let's say, passively. So my previous research, and you see here the book I have published on Oxbow about the archaeology of Roman Macedonia, I hope that challenges that view. I argued that Macedonia, in particular, shows a greater degree of conformity to imperial architectural standards than southern Greece. And the reason is quite simple. Unlike the south, Macedonia lacked a dense and continuous monumental legacy from the classical and Hellenistic periods. Roman architecture here did not have to negotiate with centuries of existing stone architecture. Instead, it operated in a landscape that was in many ways architecturally open. And this is crucial, that process was never complete. Okay. So beneath the grand villas, and you see here, of course, the villa from Dion, the Villa Dionysos, is this obsession they have to name all the villas they have found from the mosaic, beneath the grand villas, beneath the monumental city centers, beneath the palaces and the luxurious public buildings promoted by imperial authority, another architectural reality persisted, and you see it in your left. This was the world of local building traditions, long-standing construction techniques, and special practices that continued largely unchanged well into late antiquity. So what I want to do today is to explore these two architectural worlds together, not monumental architecture versus local tradition, but monumental architecture alongside them. By looking at rural settlements, upland communities, and funerary landscapes, especially tumuli, I want to show how continuity of technique and practice coexisted with and even thrived within a supposedly standardized Roman architectural world. This, let's say, structural openness meant that Roman architecture, and you see here an example from Stobi, the famous building with the arches, Roman architecture in Macedonia and Thrace was not primarily an act of replacement, but mostly an act of insertion. Roman building types would be introduced without having to negotiate long-established civic layouts or deeply embedded architectural hierarchies. In many places, Roman forms effectively created the urban framework rather than adapting to it. As a result, the Roman period marks the first moment when many settlements in the region acquired clearly articulated urban identities. Forums, baths, basilicas, theaters, and colonnaded streets did not simply embellish existing towns, they defined what a city was meant to be. These architectural ensembles followed empire-wide models instead of Roman, it's the new trend, call it empire-wide, and made the presence of Roman authority immediately legible even to those passing through. This, in my view, helps explain why Macedonia paradoxically appears more standardized in architectural terms than southern Greece. In cities such as Philippi, and you see here a picture from the south portico of the forum at Philippi, Veria, and especially Thessaloniki, Roman architectural language was applied with a degree of consistency that would have been difficult to achieve in cities burdened, let's say, with centuries of monumental precedent. The result was an urban landscape that aligned closely with imperial expectation of order, visibility, and representation, and Katerina and her students saw that in action when we visited Philippi together. Okay, so at the same time, this new, let's say, architectural order was deeply selected. Roman investment focused on certain spaces, city centers, ceremonial routes, and buildings associated with administration, leisure, and elite self-representation. These were the spaces where architecture communicated power, hierarchy, and cultural affiliation. Elsewhere, particularly beyond the urban core, architectural change was far less pronounced. And this selectivity is crucial for understanding what follows, because while Roman architecture dramatically reshaped the appearance of cities, it did not fundamentally transform the ways or the way in which people built their houses, organized their villages, or constructed their funerary landscapes. In other words, the Roman opportunity created highly visible new forms, but it did not erase older building knowledge. This tension between visibility and practice, between what was meant to be seen and what was meant to function, ran through the architectural history of Roman Macedonia and Thrace, and possibly throughout the whole empire. It allows us to see the Roman architecture not as a uniform layer spread evenly across the landscape, but as a set of interventions that coexisted with long-standing local traditions. So in the next part of the lecture, I want to step away from the cities and monuments and turn to those, let's say, less visible architectural worlds, rural settlements, upland communities, and funerary practices. It is here, I would argue, that continuity becomes most apparent and most revealing. So, and you see this beautiful picture here of the plain of Drama, where are Philippi, okay? So, to really understand how, let's say, Roman architecture functioned in Macedonia and Thrace, we need to shift scale. So far, I have been talking primarily about cities, about the places where Roman power wanted to be seen. But cities were only one part of the landscape, and for most inhabitants of the region, they were not where everyday life unfolded. Beyond the urban centers, and you see a map here from a recently published article of mine in Archaeological Reports about the archaeology of Roman Macedonia, lay a dense and varied world of villages, farmsteads, seasonal settlements, upland communities, and burial grounds. These spaces were not peripheral in a social or economic sense, but they were peripheral in terms of architectural investment. And it is precisely here that we can observe the strongest continuity of local building techniques across the Roman period. What is striking is that this continuity is not limited to a single area or cultural zone. Whether we look at lowland Macedonia, in the area of Votiea, Edessa, the foothills of Rhodope, where the picture comes from, or the mountainous landscapes of Aegean Thrace, we encounter remarkably similar construction practices. Stone gathered locally, walls built without mortar, flexible layouts adapted to uneven terrain. These techniques appear again and again, regardless of whether the surrounding political framework was Macedonian, Roman, or Byzantine. This suggests, in my point of view, that Roman rule did not impose a new architectural logic uniformly across the landscape. Instead, it introduced new forms where representation mattered most, while allowing at the same moment, or perhaps ignoring, let's say, existing construction practices elsewhere. The result was not architectural homogenization, but architectural layering. In rural contexts, and the picture you see here is from a village in Florina, a Roman period site which is called Philotas. In rural contexts, both in Macedonia and Thrace, domestic architecture remained conservative throughout the imperial period. Excavated farmsteads and village structures consistently rely on, let's say, traditional techniques that predate Roman rule. Rough stone walls, often built in dry stone construction, shallow foundations, and layouts that prioritize functionality over symmetry or monumentality. Recent excavations, many of them the results of, let's say, modern infrastructural projects like the construction of the motorway Egnatia or the Trans-Adriatic Pipe, have made this continuity visible because we have much more evidence coming from these sites. Whether in the plains of Macedonia or in the foothills, in the zones further east, rural buildings show little interest in adopting Roman architectural forms such as axial planning, standardized forms, types, or decorative facades. Even when Roman material culture appears or is present, like pottery, coins, different imported goods, the architecture itself remains local. This is a crucial point for the arguments I'm trying to make today. Architectural form does not automatically follow political change. The adoption of Roman goods or the participation in imperial economies did not necessarily lead to the adoption of Roman building techniques. Instead, local communities continued to build in ways that were familiar, reliable, and well adapted to their environment. The same pattern is visible in upland and mountainous areas, both in Western Macedonia, in the highlands of Thrace, where this map comes from. Here, in Thrace, in the mountainous landscapes of Thrace, environmental constraints made architectural continuity not only desirable, but necessary. Dry stone construction, for example, was ideally suited to rocky terrain, limited access to timber, and the need for structures that could be easily repaired or reshaped over time. So across these regions, we encounter small settlements composed of rectangular or circular buildings, a picture here from the uplands of Xanthi, often organized around open courtyards or loosely defined communal spaces. The dimension of these buildings, the thickness of their walls, and the materials used remain remarkably consistent across centuries. So what matters here is not whether these buildings can be precisely dated to the Roman period, but that many of them continued to be used, repaired, and modified during Roman times. And in some cases, occupation extended far beyond antiquity. and I see between the people watching the lecture today, Marina Tasaklakis, he can confirm that they were actually buildings that they were used until the Civil War or even later. So this long lifespan of buildings speaks to the effectiveness of these construction techniques and to their embeddedness in local building tradition. So rather than viewing these architectures as marginal or archaic or traditional, call them as you want, we should understand them as expressions of technical knowledge transmitted across generations, knowledge that did not need Roman intervention to improve or replace it. So when we examine rural architecture across Macedonia and Thrace, consistent picture begins to emerge, one that emphasizes continuity, functionality, and adaptation to local conditions rather than the wholesale adoption of Roman architectural models. Take, for example, this very interesting site, it's called Melenikitsi, a site located in the Strimon Valley, south of Siderokastro. Here, a late Hellenistic to early Roman rural building was constructed using wattle and daub, a technique that had been in use for centuries. It's a simple, pragmatic form of construction, likely representative of the everyday dwellings of ordinary rural inhabitants rather than elite farmhouses or villas. Similarly, at a site called Psili Vrisi near Edessa, which unfortunately I don't have a picture, so I'm showing you this, near Edessa, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of a small agropastoral settlement from the Roman period composed of buildings built with comparable simple techniques. These structures, as this one you see here in the picture, from Maniaki Antigonos in Florina and from Philotas in Florina, were designed to meet the practical needs of daily life, housing people, storing crops, sheltering animals. They were modest, they were functional, and clearly they were embedded in the rhythms of agrarian production. So when we move to the highlands of Thrace, and you see this beautiful picture that my friend Hayri Kurt, my colleague in Athena Research Center, took with his mobile phone, with a drone actually. So when we move to the highlands of Thrace, the pattern continues. Here, small settlements and upland farms relied on dry stone construction, circular and rectangular buildings, and layouts adapted to the rocky terrain and the steep slope. These structures, although modest in scale, display remarkable technical consistency over time, reflecting knowledge of local materials, environmental conditions, and, of course, practical needs. So, taken together, these lowland and highland examples, tell us several important things about rural architecture in the Roman period. The first one is continuity over innovation. Across different regions and social contexts, rural communities continue to build using long-standing techniques, wattle and daub in the lowlands, dry stone construction in the highlands, rather than adopting Roman masonry or standardized plans. The second is functionality and adaptability. These buildings prioritize practical needs over aesthetic or monumental concerns. Their layouts and materials were perfectly suited to local environmental conditions, whether these conditions were the fertile river valleys of central Macedonia or the rocky uplands. The third is embeddedness in the landscape. Rural architecture was deeply connected to the land, supporting agricultural and pastoral practices, and often forming part of a long-standing settlement networks that persisted from the Hellenistic into the Roman period or even later. Okay. And the fourth is persistence of local identity. Even in areas affected by Roman influence, these buildings reflect local knowledge and traditions. They were not residual or backward buildings. They were effective, they were sustainable, and they were culturally meaningful. So from the Strimon Valley to the uplands of Thrace, we see a remarkable persistence of traditional building techniques. Whether it's wattle and daub in the lowlands or dry stone construction in the highlands, these rural architectures were not passive inheritances. They were active choices, perfectly adapted to local conditions and social practices, coexisting with the monumental world of the Roman city. In short, these examples reinforce the central argument of this lecture. While Roman architecture reshaped, let's say, urban centers and elite spaces, most of the rural built environment remained rooted in local techniques, local knowledge and local traditions, creating a layered landscape where continuity and transformation existed side by side. So by placing Macedonian Thrace, by looking into Macedonian Thrace, and possibly many other provinces in the Balkans, we can begin to see a broader regional pattern. Roman imperial architecture introduced new monumental forms, reshaped city centers, created highly visible symbols of power and order. At the same time, a wide range of local architectural practices continued largely unchanged, shaping the everyday environments in which most people lived and worked. These were not competing systems, but they were parallel ones. They operated different scales, served different purposes, and addressed different audiences many times. Monumental architecture, and you see here, of course, this beautiful door at the forum with Philippi. Monumental architecture spoke the language of empire. Local architecture, the example is from a village, a site called Aspri Petra near Kozani, spoke the language of a place. It is within this broader landscape of parallel, let's say, architectures that we must situate the evidence for continuity, whether this is in rural domestic buildings, upland stone settlements, or funerary construction, such as tumuli, which I will turn to next. I didn't know how long is your lecture, but mine is around 30 minutes, okay, if this is okay. So, if we turn, therefore, to funerary architecture, specifically tumuli, because it's a particularly striking example of continuity, or if you want, traditional construction. Tumuli, and you see here the example from Voxipara, of course, the famous tumulus in northern Hebrews. Tumuli, or the burial mounds, are visible across both Macedonia and Thrace, and they provide a perfect lens through which to see how local techniques and local traditions persisted even when Roman monumental forms dominated the landscape. The tumulus is not just a grave, it's a marker in the landscape, meant to be seen from a distance. This is a tradition that stretches back millennia. Archaeological evidence shows tumuli in Macedonia and Thrace from the late Bronze Age, and continuity extends through the early Iron Age, the Classical period, and into Hellenistic times. And the most famous examples, of course, are the tumuli over the Macedonian tombs. Think of sites like Kanavas Trigono, up in the borders with Bulgaria, which is a Bronze Age tumulus, or the circular structures at Zoni, the ancient city of Zoni, which were likely covered by mounds, or the tumuli at Pendalophos, again in northern Hebrews, from the 5th to the 3rd centuries BCE. So the idea of constructing a mound over a grave is deeply embedded in the local memory. Yet something remarkable happens in the Roman imperial period. There is a clear expansion of this tumulus building, and the map here is from the northern Hebrews, the beautiful landscape, and of course the map where it is. This is not simply old habits surviving. It's a traditional architectural practice, construction practice probably, adapting to the new Roman world. It shows us that local techniques could operate alongside imperial architecture rather than being replaced by it. So let's talk a little bit about how these tumuli were built. This is where continuity of technique becomes tangible. Building a tumulus was a complex technical task. You could not just pile, soil over a grave and hope that it stayed put. The builders had to select the appropriate soils, and of course, Domna Terzopoulou made this very good PhD on the tumulus of Voxipara and analyzing all this stuff. And so the builders had to select appropriate soils, they had to mix them, they had to layer them carefully, and they had eventually to shape the mound to be stable over decades, or even centuries, or in some cases over millennia. Labor, planning, and knowledge of material properties were crucial. For example, a large tumulus like this, the one at Thrace, you see here at the picture, was 47 meters in diameter and 10 meters high. That means that would have required moving and arranging over 9,000 tons of earth. That is monumental work, but done using local methods, not imported Roman masonry or engineering techniques. What is also fascinating for me is the variability of tumulus construction. Each mound seems to have its own plan, reflecting local topography, the available soil, and the resources of the community or the family building. Some reused older burial sites, linking the dead to a long lineage of predecessors. Others responded to landscape features, visibility, or ritual considerations. In all cases, the construction was deeply embedded in local knowledge and tradition. Even within the Roman world then, and you see here a picture of this horse found in Doxipara, even under the tumulus, of course, even within the Roman world then, these mounds served multiple purposes. They memorialized the deceased, they expressed social and political claims, and they anchored the communities to the land, which is very important. At the same time, they used techniques and materials that were local, they were, let's say, traditional, and remarkably persistent. The tumulus, therefore, is a vivid example of how Roman Macedonian Thrace were not spaces of total imperial homogenization. Monumental Roman forms may have defined cities, like Thessaloniki, but rural and ritual construction continue to follow long-established practices, producing a landscape layered with both Roman visibility and local continuity. In short, tumuli are not, as some people call them, archaic leftovers. They are active participants in the Roman landscape formation. They show us that local techniques could scale up to monumental size, coexist with imperial forms or infrastructure, like Via Egnatia, for instance, and continue to shape how people experience and remember space, even as Roman architecture was transforming cities and elite life. So, in order to make that more explainable, let's say, let me turn to a very tangible example of continuity, which is the cemetery of this rather unknown site, which is called Mikrodassos at Kilkis, near the borders between Greece and North Macedonia, I think near Lake Doirani. This site gives us a very remarkably well-preserved view into how local funerary tradition persisted across centuries, even as Roman influence reshaped cities and the countryside. At Mikrodassos, we see that the native tradition of cremation cemeteries continued alongside stone-built enclosures as the dominant burial practice. And you see here, of course, in the layout, these stone enclosures that they may or may have not been covered by a mound. The tombs, dating from the 2nd century BCE to the 2nd century CE, were simple, shallow pits, rectangular or sometimes irregular in shape, but crucially, many were surrounded by low stone walls, and the tombs were often clustered together in groups within circular or rectangular enclosures. What is remarkable here is not just the form of the tombs, but what they tell us about the community itself. The organization of the cemetery, along with a variety of grave goods, and these included clay vases, figurines, coins, jewelry, weapons, tools, even handmade vessels, suggest a rural population that maintained its tradition and operated with a significant degree of social organization. This was not a marginal or a backward community that stick to their tradition. Archaeologists estimate the population at just under 2,000 individuals. For a rural settlement, that indicates density and cohesion, as well as a local economy capable of sustaining such a community over centuries. Around the 3rd century CE, of course, the cemetery shows a shift in burial practice, with cremations largely replaced by inhumation, pit tombs often covered with tiles, reflecting broader trends in the Roman Empire. Yet even here, when in this period, the layout of the cemetery, the continued use of stone enclosures, and the careful clustering of tombs demonstrate that local spatial and architectural traditions remain central to the community's identity. What Mikrodassos shows us is the coexistence of imperial and local practices. Even as broader trends in burial customs were adopted, the underlying principles of organization, spatial hierarchy, and construction technique remained remarkably continued. The cemetery, in other words, is not only a place for the dead. It's a living testament to the resilience of local knowledge, craftsmanship, and social structure. Here, in the middle of the Roman world, this is actually a picture from the area where is Mikrodassos, which is like a natural resort place, I think. Here, in the middle of the Roman world, we find a rural settlement that looks outward to the empire in its adoption of inhumation practices, yet looks inward in the way it continues centuries-old spatial and architectural traditions. The graves, the stone enclosures, the plastering of the tombs, all of this tells us that local forms of life, death, and memory persisted beneath the imperial veneer. And I remember, this is actually the gorge, the start of Axios River, okay? So this is where Mikrovasos is. So Mikrovasos, therefore, is more than a burial site. It's a microcosm of the larger rural landscape of Macedonia and Thrace, a place where local traditions endured, adapted, and coexisted with Roman cultural forms, providing, let's say, a concrete example of continuity within transformation. So if we step away from the monumental, the cities and the villas, we see a highly varied and complex landscape. Of course, there is a very crucial question. How different was this rural landscape under Roman rule compared to the earlier periods? Recent research is beginning to challenge older narratives that portrayed Roman Macedonia, and if I may add, everywhere in the Roman world, as a landscape thoroughly reorganized or dominated by imperial villa systems. And you see here, of course, the picture with the map with the villas from my book. Increasing archaeological evidence points to significant continuity from the Hellenistic period, suggesting that the rural countryside was not completely transformed by Roman administration or economic restructuring. Even when new villas appear in the archaeological record, often we see that they exist within broader zones of continuous habitation, surrounded by smaller properties and settlements that have persisted over generations. So the examples we have seen before, the Melenikitsi, the Mikrovasos, or this site here in Chalkidiki, who's called Gomati, all these humble rural settlements, along with their cemeteries, show a clear continuity with the past. They indicate that everyday life, houses, fields, and the ritual use of space remained anchored in long-standing tradition, even as Roman monumental architecture and urban forms were introduced nearby. In Eastern Macedonia and Aegean Thrace, many dispersed settlements, some with roots in Thracian tribal centers, and here the area is full of them, continued to function into late antiquity, showing only minor dislocation over several centuries. So the question for me is, what does this tell us about the built environment? And I think the answer is that it tells us that the rural landscape was not only shaped by economic concerns. So it tells us that the rural landscape was not only shaped by economic concerns, by villas and by imperial investment. And I guess most of you are prehistoric archaeologists, but for the Roman archaeologists, the obsession is this thing, that we see everything under economic sphere. Okay, it was also socially and culturally constructed, embedding local practices, local identities, and memories into the physical space. Open-air sanctuaries, and you see here very good example from the area, from Pangeon. This is the sanctuary of hero Avlonitis. Burial tumuli, forts, pastoral enclosures, and even settlement patterns themselves acted as cultural markers. They expressed communal identity, continuity, and a sense of belonging to the landscape long after the Roman conquest. For example, large cremation cemeteries like Gomati in Chalkidiki, this is where Gomati is, or ritual centers such as the sanctuary of Enudia here in Kozani, function as central places for regional communities. These sites were not only venues for cultic or funerary rituals, they were places where communities gathered, engaged in social reproduction, and reinforced ties to their territory. Similarly dispersed settlements at the foot of the Rhodope Mountains, or along the upper Strymon, or in the middle Haliakmon Valley, reveal remarkable longevity. This is a standard in all of these communities. Many of these settlements survived into the Byzantine period, demonstrating the persistence of local practices in spatial organization, construction, and land use. So even with this so-called, let's say, Romanized one, okay, and you see this beautiful picture here from Vion, therefore, the countryside was full of traditional architectural and spatial practices. Dry stone construction, round or rectangular buildings, tumuli, sanctuaries, open-air sanctuaries, and burial grounds continued to structure rural life. This does not mean that the rural population ignored Roman innovation. I want to be adamant on that. But rather that they interacted selectively with imperial forms, adopting what was useful or prestigious while retaining techniques, layouts, and special logics that were tried and trusted over generations. In short, the rural landscape shows us coexistence. The monumental alongside the modest, the imperial alongside the local, the economic alongside the ritual. Villas and city center architecture may have represented Roman ideals, whatever they were, but local building traditions, funerary practices, and sacred landscapes persisted, giving the countryside a distinctive character that blended continuity with transformation. Travelers, imagine that you are a traveler moving through Roman Macedonia, you see here a part of Via Egnatia in Albania, would not have seen a completely rational Romanized landscape. They would have encountered a countryside where ancient practices continue to shape the very way people build, found, and remember their dead. And in order to conclude and not tire you extremely, so as I conclude, I want to return briefly to the question of tradition. Because much of what I have discussed today, and this was actually the chance I was speaking at the beginning, what I have discussed today could be misunderstood if that term, tradition, is taken to imply stasis or resistance to change. From an archaeological perspective, the landscape of Roman Macedonian Thrace were anything but static. They were dynamic, they were shaped by continual choices and adjustment over time. What I have called traditional architecture, which I don't know if it's the correct term, dry stone construction, tumuli, and so on, should be understood as the result of deliberate and informed decisions. Communities continued to build in these ways, not because they lacked, let's say, alternatives, but because these techniques were effective, they were meaningful, and they were well adapted to local conditions. Tradition, in this sense, was not passive inheritance, but active practice. These choices unfolded, of course, within a Roman political and economic framework, not outside it. Rural communities participated in imperial systems, used Roman goods, and engaged with Roman power, yet this did not necessarily require architectural conformity. Instead, people adopted Roman forms selectively, where, of course, they served social, economic, or representational purposes, while maintaining long-standing building practices in everyday and rural contexts. Tradition here functioned, I think, as continuity through adaptation rather than opposition to empire, as is sometimes envisioned. This dynamic is especially clear in ritual and funerary landscapes. Tumuli, for example, as we have seen, and as I have said, were not archaic survivals, but remain socially and symbolically potent in the Roman period, even increasing in visibility in some regions, as is the region of Aegean Thrace. Open-air cult sites, including those associated with the hero rider, similarly show how older spatial practices were continually reinvested with new meaning. So taken together, these patterns invite us, you see here a recreation we did in the Aegis lab by using GIS data to do, we did a game basically in Unity. So taking together these patterns, it's Via Egnatia, okay. Taken together, these patterns invite us to rethink Roman provincial architecture. Rather than a uniform architectural layer imposed across the landscape, we see architectural layering, monumental cities and elite spaces alongside modest rural buildings, imperial visibility coexisting with local knowledge, transformation unfolding alongside continuity. In this sense, Roman Macedonia and Thrace were neither fully Romanized nor unchanged by empire. They were landscapes shaped by negotiation between past and present, negotiation between local practice and imperial frameworks. That negotiation, I suggest, is what we should understand as tradition in the built environment. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Dr. Evangelidis. It was a very interesting lecture on Roman architecture. The traditional and local architecture during the Roman times in Macedonia and Thrace, so a very rare subject. We have many congratulations, clapping
thank you.
from the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so we have to start a discussion actually. So I have to ask if there are any questions in the audience. Otherwise, we will start as a discussion. Okay, Mrs. Zeynep Akture. Hello, thank you so much for being here with us.
I thank you very much for this very excellent, really, presentation. I'm an architect, and 2 decades ago, I made a research on the ancient theaters, also in Greece, but also in Spain, France, etc. And what Professor Evangelidis is saying exactly fits into, in my opinion, my findings about the construction of theaters as well. Now we are talking about the divide between urban and rural, but I think I'm looking forward to reading your book as well, because cities, my observation was that this hierarchy in the urban structure influenced also the way theaters looked more or less Roman. As you said, the form was adapted in certain cases in lesser settlements, in more mountainous areas, more, let's say, peripheral areas. Exactly as you said, the construction techniques were fully Roman, forms were negotiated with the landscape and other traditions, etc. So I think this is a very valid point of view to explore how different parts of the Roman Empire adopted to this imperialism, let's say. My observation has been different regions had their own ways of continuity and change, and this enables a comparison of the diversity of the empire culturally. So I was really very enthusiastic about these conclusions, and especially in the religions landscape, that was my observation as well. When I had a look at the theatrical spaces in the sacred sites in Northern Macedonia, the area you were working at, I had seen continuity also because I think the Romans didn't want to change anything, and they kept the pre-existing traditions as they were. There were very few fundamental physical interventions, etc. So that also fits very well into what you have been presenting on the basis of rural-urban dichotomy, let's say. I'm really looking forward to reading your publications as well. Thank you very much. More than a question, of course, this is a commentary, but I think you will have more to say on it. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I completely agree. To tell you the truth, when Katerina invited me, and of course, Professor Ciccioni, the idea was to do something out of the box for the area. Okay, but you are absolutely right, because, and this is a shift that Roman archaeology, or the archaeology of Roman built environment, does the last 20 years after the influence of the post-colonial theories, is that we turned away from what we call monumental, or trying to find Roman forms, and we look more closely to the materials and the resources. And I do have actually examples like the ones you said from South Greece. The theater, Thera, okay, Santorini, which was a Hellenistic theater, which was reshaped in the Roman period, was mostly done by local materials, and it has a very awkward plan because this is the material they had. Okay, so taking part in the empire didn't necessarily mean that you have to do complicated facades, or I don't know, to have Cipollino marble brought from Charistos. You had somehow to adapt to the requirements of life, okay, which maybe these requirements were to have new baths or to have water, but mostly to use your own resources. And this is the center of architecture, I think, even today. rural areas. So I completely agree. And the more details we have, and the more people, and this is actually, if I may say so, this strange convergence between people who are dealing with prehistory. Actually, this happens in UK, okay? But people who are working on prehistoric landscapes and people who are working on Roman landscapes, they somehow converge because the prehistorians is because they have the material, they have the material, and this is where they extract most of their conclusions. But on the other hand, the people who deal with Roman archaeology, we have so much sources and so much text and so much, somehow we are trapped in our own interpretation that you have to turn to the material in order to find new ways of understanding culture or the material culture. So really thankful for your comments, and yes, I completely agree.
I would like to ask a question to our speaker, bringing the discussion back to the regional, to the regional aspects. You said very correctly that there was a consistency over long periods of both construction techniques and architectural forms, which is indeed logical somehow. On the other hand, we know that that Romans were acknowledged as great engineers. I won't say architects, but this engineering, the material dimension of architecture, they were very, very good in that. So how did this interfere or not with the traditional ancient old-time knowledge of adaptation in the landscape, the materials, because indeed locals knew, of course, well, the raw materials, but did they have some interference or not at all? Did they learn? Did they get anything from Romans or reciprocally?
Yeah, well, I think it's a matter of finance, to be frank. Okay,
finance.
Finance, yeah.
Okay.
One of the, I mean, one of the quintessentials Roman engineering things was, of course, the creation of opus cementitium. Okay, so this concrete that you can pour it, okay, and you can make more stable architectural forms. This is the quintessential Roman architectural form. Okay, but this is expensive, and this also can be done with materials that were not necessarily existing in Greece or Minor Asia. In Minor Asia, actually, they were using, and Professor Velkins, the late Professor Velkins, actually wrote this beautiful article back in the 80s about the architecture of Sagalassos, that they wanted to imitate the opus cementitium that you found in Italy, and they made this kind of cheapy local form that could be dismantled easily. So the people, of course, they wanted to interact with new ideas. And we have actually examples that the Roman aqueducts, okay, and when I say aqueduct, I don't mean only the bridges that we think as aqueduct, but the whole pipe, it could pass through villages and could bring new fertility and so on. And recently, this very interesting project in Grevena, in Roman Grevena, with Yannis Apostolou, who found out that in the middle of a landscape that's like the one I described, they had this kind of old-fashioned houses and blah, 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 but they did quite sophisticated Roman engineering techniques in order to improve the quality of soil. So the people, of course, they wanted to adapt new materials and new ideas and to build new houses. The problem was that they were expensive. So when something is expensive or something is quite difficult to construct technically, Okay, and I will give you another example of Macedonia. You go to what you know best, which is the local materials. So my whole point of my lecture was not that I want to show that these were some sort of archaic relics that the people will stick to it. Of course, they were somehow, how can I say, surrounded by an aura of symbolism, of tradition, localism, I don't know. But mostly they were things that the people could afford. Okay. And in North Greece, the most usual, building method, even in the cities, is called opus mixtum. It's the Greek interpretation of opus mixtum, of course, but it's not exactly opus mixtum. Opus mixtum means that you have a zone of tiles, and then a zone of stone, and then a zone of tiles, and so on. Okay. Well, this is actually a cheap solution because you don't have the means to create, or the factories to create tiles of that quality in order to build a whole brick building. And in Thessaloniki, the only real brick examples is the Octagon, which was an imperial investment, Rotunda, which also was an imperial building, and all the rest of the buildings were built with opus mixtum. So even there, it was a matter of finance. So I think tradition was, if I get what you're asking,
compromise.
Sorry?
A sort of compromise.
Exactly. It was a compromise. It's things that you know well, and you adapt to it. And yes, you can sprinkle a little bit of identity and so on, but this is how I see it, at least. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I may add something to this conversation.
Yes, please.
Okay. We are talking about an empire. So I want to introduce something about architecture and focus a bit on the construction. Yes. I think there are two things that can be crystallized on the architecture that are very relative to the idea of the empire. The first one is the legislation, the construction legislation, and I think the Roman one was, we have much information with Vitruvius and many more, people who wrote about how they should build, or what a brick, what size it should be, or the safety of the people when building stuff.
Yes.
And maybe what should the mortar be like? Have like the aggregates like very specific, or the ceramic powder, the ones the Romans had. The brick was the same brick from Spain to Minor Asia, or even further. There was one brick with one dimension. So I think this would be very interesting to look at when we are trying to, see the local, the traditional architecture, if it fits, if we have things like that. So I think the legislation could be seen on the material left.
Well, now, I mean, you obviously don't want to finish today the lecture, because you open now a new, a broad theme of discussion.
Just opening.
Yeah, because this is actually refers to the. It's my personal view, of course. Okay, this actually refers to the structure of the empire itself, and when we say empire, sometimes we envision the Roman Empire as this kind of Chinese-like central bureaucratic state that Roman Empire was not. Okay, so Vitruvius might have written a manual, because this is what it is, of how to build or what to do, but what it mattered locally was the capacity of the cities, or of the individuals, or of the villages to build with what they had. Okay, and since we were discussing at the beginning about how people, the audience in France wants to open in this kind of discussion, the rest, I'm taking part now in this project. I will bring to French students a handbook about Roman Greece, done by Olga Gunel and Professor Isakis. that actually I was commissioned to write the chapter on the finance or the economy of building the Roman city. Okay. And legislation, yes, there was there. And instructions, of course, they were there. But most of it, most of the thing was like the finance. Can you afford it? Is someone willing to pay to build this kind of tile with good quality soil from Italy or not? So I think the empire was working in different levels. Okay, so there was, in my way of seeing things, is that there was a template somehow, but this could be actually adapted to local conditions and to local needs and local necessities. So in there were different things playing a role. It was the money, it was the local preferences, it was the local knowledge, because, I mean, if somebody was coming to Traianopolis here or to Avira to build a building, you wouldn't have come from Rome or from Thessaloniki. It would have been a local architect or a local, craftsman or a builder. So it's also the knowledge of the technician, the knowledge of the builder of how to build this thing. And I think, and as we all know in Greece from our houses, whatever you tell them, they do it in their way. So this is how the things work also in the empire.
Okay.
So I think that's the legislation was, the order was there, but also there was like a broad interpretation of this law. So this is my opinion. Yeah.
Okay. Just one more thing to add on this, because you said it. You said, okay, the people will build. There are some guilds that probably build something during this time. So I would like to focus on the modular system and the metric system. Maybe this would be, a part, a very, specific part that we could focus and see if it evolves. If the metric system was, for example, in the beginning, like the Greek metric system, and after a while it changes because the guilds start to work in a different way, and we see, the columns built in a different or the grid in different
possibly. This needs an architect, okay, because I'm not an architect. But I have an example, however, for what you are talking about. The south portico of the Forum of Thessaloniki, it was built with, I think, 2/3 of it with the Greek modular unit, and then it changed to, I think, to a Roman modular unit. So there are examples like that. But this needs someone who is a trained architect in order to go and do this kind of research. But you're absolutely right.
Okay, thank you. So, do we have questions?
Apparently, I covered everyone.
I don't see any hands. So maybe we can switch off our presentation at this point. Thank again very, very warmly Dr. Evangelidis, and we look forward, I personally look forward to seeing you at Philippi area this summer.
Oh, thank you.
Please,
I will do. Yeah.
Stop by and see us.
Definitely.
I'm sure that there are plenty of questions in terms of material. The fantastic wattle and daub that you show us.
Yes, definitely. I actually forgot to mention there are other examples up here in the mountain of Xanthi, but we can discuss it in person. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Once more, thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you for your presence. And see you in the next cycle, maybe.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.